Have you ever asked yourself that question? The question that can change depending on what we mean. Who is God like? What is He like? Is He righteous or is He just? Which of these religions has the right one? Or maybe, who is God like? Who does He think He is, leaving me in my despair? These are questions that the story of Moses orbits around, because these are questions that I would think the Israelites and Moses himself found themselves wrestling to answer. After all, God gives His answer to this prophet who was unwilling to speak for Him, a priest who was reluctant to sacrifice because of his unholy past, a king who was terrified to lead because he knew he could never live up to the task that was before him. This is his story, Moses, the man of God. Who is Moses? The story of Moses is a deeply human story, but to get the full depth of it, you really need to start back in the book of Genesis, when God tells Abram that his offspring are going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And so they were, and over the course of centuries, the Israelite people began to outnumber the Egyptians. So when a new Pharaoh arose over the land, a new king who did not like the Israelites, a deep anti-Semitism began to course through the veins of the Nile. After some quick research, that this new Pharaoh of Egypt forced the Israelites to build large and imposing temples to gods they did not worship. He forced them to build a nation founded on war and bloodshed. He ruthlessly made them work as slaves, all things that are directly opposed to the God of the Israelites. But when this did nothing to thwart the growth of Israel, Pharaoh demanded that every firstborn male be cast into the Nile and drowned. This is where we meet Moses. Moses was born into this chaotic mess around the year 1390 BC under the Egyptian reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Moses is born into a long and complicated family history. If the genealogy of Exodus 6 is to be of any account, then by no means is Moses born into a perfect family. Full of these weird interconnecting relationships, when Moses is born, his mother hides him so that he might have a chance at survival. But when the boy becomes too large or too loud, Moses' mother is forced to trust in the God who has been silent all her life. And she sets Moses adrift down the Nile River in a basket made of bitumen and pitch. Moses drifts down the River Nile and into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter. Tradition has made this royal residence the city of Tanis, where the daughter of Pharaoh may have been attending a religious ritual. Regardless, it's here where she sees the child drifting and hears the child crying and takes pity on him. She names him Moses. In Hebrew, the word means drawn out of, like how Pharaoh's daughter drew Moses out of the water. But in Egyptian, the word is just a suffix, and it means born of, like he's born of Ra. In this case, the daughter of Pharaoh would be saying that Moses was born of no one, drawn from nowhere. He is a man without an identity who was set adrift and rescued by the most unlikely of hands. You see, Moses here becomes an image of the Israelite people, seemingly from nowhere, drawn through the water and brought into a family that he has made an integral part of as a growing nation. Moses grows up in the palace of Pharaoh, likely becoming intimately familiar with Egyptian culture and history. He would have witnessed the violent military campaigns against the Hittite people to the north. And if I were to guess, I'd say he would have been a bit of an outcast in the palace of Pharaoh. Well, 40 years go by when Moses looks out upon the burdens of the Israelite people, knowing that the Pharaoh was launching a campaign against the people of his own kind. The just heart of Moses cannot take it any longer. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, there were two Hebrews struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid, and he thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So Moses fled to the land of Midian, and when he got there, he sat down by a well, exhausted and hungry, no doubt. Off in the distance, a group of women appear on the horizon who have come to draw water for their herds. Story goes that suddenly a band of rogue shepherds chased the women away. Despite his weariness, Moses rescues the women, and then he waters their flock. When they go back, they relay this heroic tale to their village. Moses is invited to stay with the nomadic Midianites. Here, Moses marries Zipporah, who gives birth to a son named Gershom. During the time that Moses was in Midian, Seti I dies, and his son Ramesses II takes over. Ramesses II was more fiercely opposed to the Semitic people in his kingdom than his father. Therefore the people of Israel cried, and they groaned all the more because of the harshness of their slavery. Have you ever asked yourself, who is God? I'm sure the Israelites did. I'm sure Moses did. Well, God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. One day Moses was tending to his father-in-law Jethro's flock of sheep. Moses had gone into the wilderness to the east, a very similar place that Adam and Eve would have found themselves east of Eden. And so it's kind of unsurprising that we're told that Moses led the flock west, where he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. Something must have caught his eye that day, something miraculous, because when Moses went over to get a better look, what he actually found was an answer to the question that he and his people had been asking for centuries. Moses, Moses, here I am. Do not come any nearer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, the taskmasters, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And so God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. But here Moses contends with the Lord. He is convinced that the Israelites will not believe him, so God commands Moses to throw down his staff. And when he does, it becomes a venomous snake. But who has control over the snake? God commands Moses to pick it back up, and by the tail, no less. Again, the Lord gives Moses another sign. He commands Moses to put his hand into his cloak, but when Moses takes it out, his hand is all white and leprous. But who has command over sickness and death? So when God tells him to put his hand back in his cloak, it is restored. Even though God has definitively shown that he has command over death and creation, Moses still contests his position as prophet. Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. And then the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him, and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him, and take in your hand the staff with which you shall do the signs. God led the people of Israel out of Egypt by a pillar of fire at night, and by day the Lord appeared to them as a pillar of cloud. The people followed God wherever he went. Soon the people came to Pi-hahiroth, nearly a day's journey away. In front of them was the vast Red Sea, but behind them the army of Pharaoh quickly approached. So Moses got up and he said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And the pillar of God moved between the people of God and the Egyptians. As Moses raised his staff high into the air, suddenly a strong west wind made the sea a dry land, and the chaotic waters of uncreation stood up on either end as a wall divided for the people to pass safely through. The people of God looked out over the deliverance that God had won for them. They looked out and saw a God who had complete control over the land and the sea. They saw their God who overthrew the Egyptian pantheon as though without even trying, and he was the king of all creation. In that moment, he had control over all the nations, and the people of God looked out, and they had an answer in their yearning hearts to their profoundly simple question. He is the God who saves. You see, Moses was 80 years old when God brought Israel out of Egypt, and he had been asking this question all his life, a question that we all wrestle with. Who is God? But now, along with all of Israel, he needed to ask a much deeper, a much more difficult question. Why would God save me? This is the story of Moses, the man of God on the mountain. The Israelites stand on the far side of the shore that day, singing a song of God's salvation. This is only the beginning. The second they turn their backs on this miraculous power, they forget the answer to the profoundly simple question. They begin to ask a new one. Why would God save us? Like the first question, this one too can change depending on how you ask it. Some people actually want to know the function of why God would save a sinful people. What purpose is that? Others want to know how it's possible that God would ever save someone so sinful. This is when we find Israel heading towards Sinai. Now it's true, a lot happens in the 3 months while Israel is in the wilderness of Iman. It's from Exodus 16 until 19, and they leave the Red Sea, and they begin to follow God for the first time. I think all of that stuff is crucial, vitally important, and exciting, but it would be best explored in the next Moses video. For now, we meet the congregation of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, where all creation is coming together to meet God. Take a moment and think about what it would be like to come into direct contact with the sun. Sunglasses just aren't going to do it, and God knows this. In the same way that people aren't designed to land on the sun, people are not designed to be in God's full, unadulterated presence while sinful and fallen. They would just die immediately. And so, like the gods from the surrounding nations, God descends onto the top of a tall mountain, a safe distance away from the people of Israel. God calls Moses up to himself on Mount Sinai, and when Moses gets up to God, he speaks to Moses like a friend. God says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Therefore, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses then has to descend back down the mountain and tell Israel all that the Lord plans for them, that God plans to prosper them into this bountiful, beautiful nation because of his great salvation. Israel is supposed to respond to this miraculous salvation out of thankfulness and reverence to their God and King. God even tells them how they can do this. They are to obey his voice and keep his covenant. After all, The assumption here is that God's life-giving voice and his just covenantal laws are designed to lead people into his presence and flourish out into the world. It really is a win-win for Israel: salvation and flourishing under the just protection of God as their king. So it's really no surprise that when Moses tells them all of this, the people eagerly accept the Lord's partnership. And so, Moses then has to go back up the mountain and relay all of this information to God. You know, if you've ever climbed a mountain or even just a big hill, you can begin to see the problem here. Moses then has to go back down to the people and tell them all that they need to do to get ready to meet God. He's not going to stay up on the mountain high away from the people forever. The 10 Commandments. 3 days pass before the people come face to face with the sun. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. The Lord of heaven and earth, the God of all creation, breaks through time and space, matter and spirit, and descends onto Mount Sinai. Here, Moses then goes back up while the people wait at the base. God tells Moses that no one should come up the mountain, or else they might die. However, it would be best for Aaron to meet God here too. But before Moses can leave and go and get Aaron, God begins to give Moses the foundation of human morality, the 10 Commandments. In fact, the 10 Commandments are so foundational to the human experience that the rest of the laws given throughout the Old Testament are just variations and explanations of these 10 laws. All of them are designed so that the people of God can flourish in God's unhindered presence. To them, it's like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In fact, God seems to have a garden in mind for them. He tells Moses of this land that has become so violent, so drenched in blood and injustice, that God's not going to stand for it any longer. Little by little, he says, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out from before you. After all of this, after Moses receives the 10 Commandments, after Moses is told that Israel is no longer a slave to the nations but is God's people, after Moses is told that Israel is a royal priesthood, God asks Moses to go and gather a bunch of the leaders from Israel and to share a meal with him. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank during this feast. God calls Moses to come up just a little higher, and so Moses takes with him Joshua to stand at a distance. Presumably the elders go back down. God wants this to be a regular practice for all the people of Israel, to eat and to drink in his presence. And so God gives Moses instructions of building God a house. God is going to come down off of the mountain and live among the people. God has everything in place. Indeed, the people only need to be still and know that he is God and is on their side. In fact, he has even raised up the Egyptians for this very purpose. Nevertheless, God has made his dwelling among the people of Israel, and he's going to live amongst the people. The Book of the Covenant. At this point, God goes on to speak to Moses, and he says, "Do not worship any other god or make yourself a molten calf. Do not drink the blood of any other nation or make yourselves unclean with them. And do not make yourselves unclean with their practices. Do not make any covenant with them. And so the Israelites know that you can leave Egypt in peace." You would think that Israel found their leader that day in Moses. They were wrong, mistaken, and they will be again when they demand that the prophet Samuel put a new king over them. For in truth, Israel could only ever have one leader, one king. But Moses stood in his image that day as a shadow of one to come. For a true king is someone who can consistently lead the people of God, protecting their hearts and their minds in righteousness and justice. A king is someone who reflects God's very own law. Indeed, God himself. Anything less than that is merely mimicking the unjust nations God saved the people from that day. This is why Adam and Eve found themselves forsaking their royal responsibilities. They had failed to trust that God would teach them true justice and true righteousness. Now they know that their actions mean death. And since God refuses to trick humanity, to undermine their spirits, he will remain morally consistent. The gods of the other nations were never morally consistent. A morally consistent God was a nonsensical reality in the ancient world. Therefore, the true God, the true King of creation, determined to rewrite the narrative. Recall the Canaanite story of power, order, and chaos that formed the hearts and the minds of the Canaanite people. Remember, the chief deity of Canaan was tricked into electing Yam to be a successor. Baal, infuriated, plans a coup. And when everyone tells him to calm down, he reacts with rage, murdering his king Yam. Of course, this injustice caused Mot, the god of death in the Canaanite pantheon, to seek vengeance. But before Mot can kill Baal, Baal has him imprisoned for all eternity in the underworld, giving the chief god no choice but to elect Baal as his successor. You'd do well to see how these are the stories that the Canaanites chose to form their moral code of conduct. But who is the moral character in this creation? Who is the character that doesn't lie, trick, steal, or change their mind once in this story? Who is the calm-headed and morally constant one? I can save you the time. None of them. And so we meet Yahweh, the King of creation, in the Garden of Eden. Faced with the task of being the king, humanity is going to be fruitful and multiply, and they will subdue the earth to rule over it. But after learning the bitter knowledge of good and evil, this purpose will be toilsome as we clamor for power over one another, as we disintegrate into moral chaos and are entombed in our own inconsistencies, forsaking our royal responsibility. And so God makes a promise to liberate us from this death, saying that one day a king will come from the woman to crush the head of the snake. And though the snake may bruise his heel, the chaotic principality of this world will one day come crashing down. And so we meet Israel, standing on the far side of the Red Sea, singing a song of praise to their true God and their true King. For he was the one who overthrew the chronic king of Egypt, led in their praise of worship by Moses, the man of God. The Israelites sang this song to the king. I will sing to the king, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The king is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The king is a warrior. The king is his name. But as soon as they turn their backs on this all-powerful king, sin overtakes the hearts and minds of the people. They began their journey south and east, in the wilderness of Shur, just west of Sinai. The congregation of Israel, though they have seen the miraculous salvation of their king, begins to forget that he was the one who provided for them. They began to complain about not having enough food and not having enough water in the desert. The whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the king's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. And so the King of Israel, Yahweh, says that he will cause it to rain food from heaven, and a light dew substance covers the ground where Israel was. And quail came up without number. The people had food for 6 whole days, and on the 7th they were commanded to rest. And so God provides more than plenty for them. On the 6th day they called the food manna, which means, what is it? They claimed it tasted like bread and honey, and they ate this manna the entire time they were in the wilderness. Through thick or thin, love or hate, mutiny or rest, the King God will not cease to provide for his people. But the people will consistently reject any notion of God as their king and provider. You see, the people eventually arrive at Rephidim, where there's no water. And when the people begin to scream and complain, God then tells Moses to strike a rock with his staff.
and God will cause water to miraculously spring out of the rock. If they didn't know he had control of the water before, they would certainly see it now. And so, Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the king, saying, "Is the king among us or not?" A fitting question, for in their song of praise the Israelites exalted God as their warrior king. But now, in the wilderness, they are forced to trust this king in new ways, to provide. They find that they are not up to the task. Then suddenly Amalek sweeps down into the valley, attacking Israel on all sides. Moses quickly rallies the commanders of Israel. Joshua is to fight against the attackers, while Moses will go up on the hill with Aaron and Hur to intercede. Moses raises his staff high into the air, and then the congregation begins to fight back. So Moses keeps his staff high while Aaron and Hur help keep his arms lifted. And when he does this, Israel prevails against Amalek. A beautiful picture, really, of God's actions through his people. Israel defeats the warring enemies. Moses builds an altar here and calls it, "The Lord, the King, is my banner." And while in the wilderness of Midian, Moses' father-in-law Jethro meets him. Jethro notices that Moses is exhausted. Moses, acting as prophet, priest, and king of Israel, is too much for one man. Plus, God had called all of Israel to reflect those characteristics. Indeed, God has called all of humanity to act in those roles, and so Jethro encourages that Moses delegate this authority out to the people.
And this is a significant moment for Israel, for the one who bears these offices bears the very image of God out into the world. They are, therefore, expected to now be the morally consistent ones, the leaders in the world. Israel, from here on out, is called to be holy, set apart from all of the other nations. At Mount Sinai, this is when and why Moses receives the law at Mount Sinai, detailing how Israel will forever be set apart from the nations. Unfortunately, no one, not even Moses, can uphold this law. For if they could, they would be like God. They need rituals to be pure, a curtain to separate them from God, and a mediator until God himself will redeem them. Moses, therefore, at the end of his priestly ministry, we find him unable to enter the tabernacle. Instead, God wants Moses to reflect him in a new way. The priesthood will begin to cycle through the Levites, but Moses is preparing to go to war. The land that God is bringing the Israelites to has dissolved into the chaos of uncreation. And so, God, by his magnificent providence, is bringing order to the disorder. Therefore, all the men of war are to be numbered throughout the camp. But these warriors will also be unique. They are to bring alongside their swords words of peace. They are to bring a relentless trust in the God who saves them. And if these men are to go to war, they will need God to unmake them first. And this is why the greatest catastrophe of the congregation would not be the loss of fighting men, but the desecration of the tabernacle. And so the Levites were not allowed to be counted, for they were not allowed to fight. No, the Levites would never fight a war with swords. The priests fought in a much more radical way, holiness. And to ensure this reality, God sets up his most profound war formation. You see, in the book of Numbers, we are told that to the south lay Gad, Reuben, and Simeon. Given their numbers, they would have been about this large. On the west, Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh, about this big. To the north, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali formed. And finally, on the east, the side where the sun rises, was to be Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. By far, the largest formation. In their midst, at the very heart, the center of the congregation, was to be the presence of God, the tabernacle. No creature was to cross that line. And there, from the inner tent, the King of the Israelites, Yahweh, watches over the congregation and all of his people as they went to war. But these people don't have any idea what they are about to endure, for they have never fought in a war. They have no idea what to expect. Therefore, they will always need to be reminded that the tabernacle, and not the battle they will face, is to be their home.